Okay, we're going to continue with chapter 19 this evening.
Verse 11?
No, verse 7.
7. Oh, I skipped ahead.
You didn't think I was getting that far, did you? If there's any reputation I have that I'm sure is well deserved, is I'm slow. I teach like Stan drives. All right.
That is slow.
What's that?
That is slow.
Really?
Keeps it on the road, dude.
Okay, again, chapter 19, we got down to verse 7, which is where we'll pick up this evening. And keep in mind, at this particular point, the quotation we're given is identified in verse 5. It says, "And a voice came from the throne." Well, again, this voice, best guess is it's probably one of the seraphim, because, of course, the seraphim are the ones that attend the throne of God. Now, this is a guess on my part, but what we can be sure of is this is not the voice of God. It's somebody who's attending the throne, who it said the voice came from the throne, but not God. And we'll see that in this passage, especially down at verse 10. But as this voice continues, and I'm not really sure why John just refers to it at this point as a voice, unless the seraph or whoever it was steps forward while he's speaking. Because John doesn't say, well, I saw an angel, or I saw a seraph, or I saw this or that. He just says he heard a voice. But as this voice continues, then he apparently is face to face with whoever this is later in this passage, which is why we know it is not God who is speaking. But verse 7 says, "Let us rejoice and be glad and give the glory to him." And again, that's a clue right there. This is not Christ speaking. "Give the glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready." Now notice in all of this, the marriage of the Lamb happens almost at the very end of the tribulation period. Now, keeping in mind that John does not write, for the most part, chronologically, as he gives details, many of those details he does give chronologically, but he bounces around as he gives different stories. But I say it at the end because if you bounce forward to verse 11, the next thing that happens is the second coming. Well, I can give you probably a couple of reasons why, in all probability, the marriage of the Lamb happens at the very end of the tribulation period. When we are raptured and given new bodies and stand before the throne, what's probably one of the first things that has to occur before the marriage of the Lamb?
Judgment seat of Christ.
There you go. Judgment. So that might take a little bit of time. Judgment. And then all what we've been studying for the last several months is all of these, not the judgment seat of Christ, mind you, with the church, but the judgments, curses and what have you, whatever you want to call them, that are poured out upon the earth. Now, if there is joy in heaven over the marriage of the Lamb, would it make sense for all of these judgments on the earth to happen at the same time? It's like, well, let's have a wedding here. Oh, wait a minute. We need to pause for a few minutes while I pour out this judgment on the earth. And then we'll continue with celebration. And, well, it doesn't make any sense. And I think you can see why it would be obvious that you wouldn't have the judgments being poured out. And especially, not just on the earth, but who else is undergoing judgment on the earth during this time?
Satan.
What's that?
Tribulation saints and stuff.
Well, not the tribulation saints. They've actually been exempted from that because they've accepted Christ.
No, I'm just saying they have to come up and they'd be at the end also.
What is the second thing that, besides judgment upon the earth, what is the other purpose of the tribulation period?
To bring the Jews to Christ.
To bring the Jews to salvation. So you're talking two different groups of God's people. The bride of the Father, which is Israel, and the bride of Christ, which is the church. It's, as we follow through all of the things that are going on here, it does not make any sense to have the bride of Christ being presented to Christ. At the same time, the Father is still dealing with the sins of Israel. I think at this point, especially when we begin verse 11, the focus is entirely at that point on the church and the wedding. So that's why I say I think at this point we are at the very end of the tribulation period, just before the second coming. And in fact, this may be that, what was it, about a month-long period, because Daniel gave two different lengths of time. He gave exactly 3.5 years from the tribulation, but then he said, blessed are those who, persevere to, I think, what was the exact number?
1290.
Yeah, 1290. It was an additional month, which makes you wonder, okay, what's going on in this additional month? I think two things are going on. The marriage of the Lamb, and Christ is preparing himself at this point to bring Israel into the fold.
Pastor, just real quick, I guess what I was asking was, when I said the said tribulation saints, was at that point then really the church is complete. I mean, you have all the tribulation saints that are going to be there, is that?
Nope.
Okay, that's
Not
what I'm
yet.
trying to get. Okay, that's what
Not yet.
Thank you. Okay.
That happens in chapter 10.
Okay.
Tribulation saints at this point are still disembodied spirits. They have not been resurrected. They are in heaven, yes. And before the throne, you'll recall they've been given white robes to, give them a degree of glorification, if you want to call it that at this point. But they have not yet been resurrected. That's in chapter 10, which we'll see in a moment. And by the way, that's an important consideration.
10 or 20.
What's that?
10 or 20.
What did I say? Well, 20. I don't know why I said 10.
Said it twice.
Yeah, I did, now that you mention it. Chapter 20.
All right. Yep,
Okay.
no problem. I understand what you're saying now.
Okay.
Well, I said it twice. What's 10 times 2? 20.
They're not part of the church, so they're not part of the wedding of the Lamb.
Not at this point, no.
That's, yeah.
But I think this whole issue with the tribulation saints, I think, is important to keep in mind, because as I mentioned to you last week, while the wedding takes place here in heaven, there is strong evidence to indicate the feast that occurs happens just after the second coming. And I think one of the reasons for that may in fact be the resurrection of the tribulation saints. In fact, okay, go ahead if you will, fast forward. I don't usually do this, but go to chapter 20.
Okay.
Chapter 20. Go to chapter 10 times 2.
Okay, got it.
Look in verse 4. Chapter 20, verse 4 says, "And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given to them." Now, of course, Who is the they at this point? Well,
They did worship the beast.
Borders?
the church. And that's one of the reasons I kind of neglect, for the most part, I tend not to jump ahead too often because then you get things out of context. But at this point, keep in mind the second coming will have just occurred. We begin that again in halfway through chapter 19. Well, notice then in verse 4 of chapter 20, it says, "And I saw thrones, plural, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given to them." Well,
24 elders?
not just the 24 elders. How many times have we seen in the Bible what says, what will we be doing with Christ?
Reigning.
Reigning.
Yeah.
Well, if you're going to reign, what have you got?
Authority.
Authority and a throne. Because he's the king, and if we are reigned, not to say that we are in any way deserving of being kings and queens, but we're going to reign with him. So John says he saw thrones, plural. And they sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. Also keep in mind, now it does not happen at this point, but you recall what Paul said about us and angels? So even said, don't you know that we, speaking of us, the church, will judge angels? Yes. Now, here's the clue. "And I saw the souls," notice it does not say bodies at this point, they have not yet been resurrected. "And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark upon their forehead and upon their hand, and they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years." There is your resurrection of the tribulation saints.
Okay.
Just after the second coming.
Yep.
Now, there's a couple of things, and I only want to kind of hit the highlights on this because obviously when we get to chapter 20, we're going to dig into this deeper. It says that they were beheaded, and by the way, even in just the last few years, and this is one of the reasons why I'm convinced that Islam will be a major force politically throughout the world during the tribulation period. I think it may very well be one of the political tools that the Antichrist uses to take over the world. Because, and here's what we've seen in the last few years, when Islamic radicals kidnap somebody, what do they tend to do with them?
Behead them.
They cut their heads off. Especially Christians. That has already been proven to be their preferred method of execution. Decapitation. And we see here that it says these aren't just executed, they were beheaded. Second thing we see out of this is, it says, at this point, they came to life. In other words, they're resurrected. And it says they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Well, where's the church in all of this?
Gone.
What's that?
It's gone, isn't it?
No.
Right there.
We're there.
Yeah.
This is just after the second coming.
Okay.
So if it's just after the second coming, where's the church going to be? Right here on earth,
With
reigning with Christ. So if it says that the tribulation saints will be resurrected at that point and they will reign with Christ for 1,000 years, what does that tell you about their position with the church?
Same.
well,
They will join together with the church at that point.
Okay.
They are going to be adopted into the church at the point of their resurrection, which will occur when the church is here on earth just after the second coming. Now, that is one of the reasons why I think there's a strong indication that the marriage supper of the Lamb will take place at that point, because Christ is going to have a whole new crowd to add to his bride.
How much can they eat if they don't have a head? You're saying they get their heads back.
There's always one. I would say again, but with you it's still. All right. Now, back to, where did we leave off?
We were
All right.
on 4.
Verse 8. Back to chapter 19, verse 8.
All right.
All right, and it said, well, actually, let's go back to 7 and finish this up. It says, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. Which tells us two things have occurred. First off, if the bride is ready, this tells us judgment, of the church has already occurred. And also, compare this with a traditional Jewish wedding of the first century. And by the way, we're not talking a pauper's wedding because we're talking the Lamb. So this is not going to be a poor man's wedding. And in a rich, well-to-do wedding of Israel in the first century, the father of the groom was responsible for providing the wedding guest with their appropriate clothing. Now you'll recall, for example, one of the parables that Jesus told was of those who were invited to the wedding, because of course he's speaking of Israel and said, well, all of these people were invited and they came up with excuses why they couldn't come. And so the father of the groom sends them out and says, go invite everybody, get anybody you can. But then some of them showed up and they were what?
Locked out.
What's that?
Locked out.
Well, yes, but here's why. They were inappropriately clothed. Why? Because the father of the groom provided them, as the guests come, he provided them with the appropriate wedding clothing. So if anybody showed up inappropriately clothed, then they were considered interlopers, like you were not invited. You got to, you have to leave. What does the Bible tell us are the wedding clothes of the church?
The
Nope.
blood of Christ.
You're on the right track. The righteousness of Christ. Said we are clothed with the righteousness of Christ himself. Well, again, judgment has occurred, and we have been by this point because of judgment, all our sins have been done away with. They're forgotten, never to be brought up again. And we are now appropriately clothed for the wedding
And
because
the father of the groom has provided that clothing.
there you go. Father of the groom has given us all the appropriate clothing. However, we see that there will be guests at the wedding. Not just the bride herself, but there's going to be guests. Let's see here. Verse 8, it says, it was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. And he said to me, write, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are true words of God. In other words, I'm telling you the truth here. God said, blessed are those who are invited. Well, it's absolutely ridiculous to consider a bride as requiring an invitation to her own wedding. So the church is not among those who are invited. We are a participant. So who then could possibly be those who are invited? It says, blessed are those who are invited.
The angels.
There's one right there. The angelic host will be invited, because also we see that when in the second coming and Christ returns on his white horse followed by this horde of people, there's two groups in that, the church and the angelic host. So there's your first group that are invited. Who else would be invited?
The tribulation saints?
The elders.
No, because, the elders are actually part of the church, remember?
Yeah.
They're part of the bride of Christ.
The 12 of the tribes of Israel.
You're on the right track. Hold that thought. All right, back to what you just said with the tribulation saints. Remember, the tribulation saints will be resurrected just after the second coming and will take their place with the church.
So, okay. I just
So if they take their place with the church, they're going to be part, at that point, they will then be part of the bride of Christ and will step up, and they will no longer be invitees, they will be part of the bride.
They'll sort of be participants in.
Yeah, so they're not invitees, they are, participating in all this.
Gotcha.
Now back to what you just said.
12 patriarchs.
Well, not just the 12 patriarchs, but the whole,
44,000?
not just those. Consider all of the Old Testament saints. Because now we know the Old Testament saints will never be part of the bride of Christ. Why?
Because they're part of the old
Because they're
covenant.
the
Well, not just
bride of
that.
God.
There you go. What she said. They're already married. Who's the bride of the Father?
Israel.
Israel. And even the Gentiles in the Old Covenant, if you were a Gentile and you then converted to Judaism, in other words, you accepted the true God as your God, what happened?
You became a Jew.
You became spiritually a Jew.
So
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar and Moses and Elijah will all be there.
All of them. And here's a good biblical example we have of that. Ruth was a Moabitess. And actually, in the law of God, it said that no Moabite would ever step foot in the temple. Why? I mean, this is in the law. Because you remember,
The Moabites did not allow Israel to go through their land when they were.
there you go. The Moabites were blood relatives of the Jews, and yet they turned their backs on them during the wilderness wanderings. And so for that reason, it's actually in the law that no Moabite or Ammonite would ever step foot in the temple. Yet Ruth was a full-blown, full-blooded Moabite. How then did she manage to become a part? And not only just a part of that, she was the great-grandmother of King David himself. How? Not just that, although you're on the right track.
Naomi's God was her God.
There you go. She declared that the God of Israel was now her God, which meant at that point, in the eyes of the law, she was no longer a Moabite. She was now an adopted Jew. That prohibition of Moabites no longer applied to her because in the eyes of the law, she's now an Israelite. And because there was a provision, or should say is a provision in the law of Moses, that no matter where you are from, none of that, if you declared your faith in the law of Moses, the law, or not the law, I meant to say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you were then in the eyes of the law a Jew.
People, not a race.
So all of those, to include Nebuchadnezzar, as you mentioned, if indeed Nebuchadnezzar did come to faith, and I think the Bible gives a pretty good case for that, they will all be standing there as part of the bride of the Father, which means they will not be participants in this wedding, but they will be invited guests at the wedding feast of the Lamb.
I have a question for you.
Shoot,
Will Adam and Eve be there?
I would think so, because they would be Old Testament saints. Although it's interesting that under the law, Adam and Eve themselves would have been considered Gentiles, because there was no such thing as a Jew until Jacob.
So all of the antediluvian people would not be Jews.
No, because there was no such thing as a Jew then. But if they worshiped the true God, they came under the law. Although the law had not yet been given, they still came under that covenant later on. You say something?
Just because they believed in the law and the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
God. Yeah. Faith.
Because again, the issue is, while yes, the covenants are important, what is ultimately as important is, what did they put their faith in? Did they put their faith in the coming Messiah? Remember, the only difference between us on this side of the cross and the resurrection versus those on before is we know by name who the Messiah was. We put our faith in him. Before the cross, Old Testament saints didn't know who the Messiah would be. They didn't know when he would come, but they knew that God had promised that he would come. And when that happened, They would be a part of that. So their salvation, and we see in Hebrews, as this declares that Abraham was declared righteous by faith. Faith in what? Faith in God's promise of Messiah. So it makes no difference. It just depends on where you're looking forward or looking backward. All right.
One more question. Confusing when it says, for the fine linen is the righteous act of the saints, not for the righteous act of Christ.
It does at this particular point, but also keep in mind that the Bible tells us that our righteousness are as what? Filthy rags. That our righteousness, and even this, even in the context of our so-called righteous acts, what makes us righteous? What makes our acts righteous?
Jesus.
It's His righteousness, not ours. Look, if you will, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Chapter 3, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. In verses 13 through 15, says, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built upon it remains, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as through fire. In other words, when we stand before the judgment seat of God, everything that we have done which is not righteous will be, and I think obviously this is symbolic that Paul is talking about, because we certainly aren't going to stand before the judgment seat of God in a resurrected body and get burned up. He's talking our sins will be burned away. And what's left? Our righteousness. All right, now look in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And let's see, chapter 5, verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. And then down at verse 21, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him.
Propitiation.
Actually, propitiation doesn't quite mean that. Propitiation means that Christ took he became the brunt of God's wrath on our behalf.
Okay. Gotcha.
All right, let's see here. Okay, one other point. Look in John chapter 3. John chapter 3, verse 29. It says, he who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice, and so this joy of mine has been made full. Well, of course, who naturally are friends of the bridegroom? Well, you've got the church, which is the bride. We don't count in this because, again, we're not going to be guests at our own spiritual wedding. Well, who else would be friends of the groom? The Father,
The angelic host.
the angelic host, nation of Israel,
The Old Old Testament saints.
Old Testament saints. All right. Verse 9. That's back in chapter 19, by the way. We'll try to go through verse 10, and that'll be it for the night. Verse 9 says, "And he said to me, Write, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are true words of God. And at that point, he says, And I fell at his feet." Now this is why we know here in verse 10, all of these things that are being said, John at this point is face to face with whoever it is that's saying this. But verse 10 proves to us it is not Christ or even the Father. It says, "And I fell at his feet to worship him. And he said to me, Do not do that." That in it alone tells us it is not God. It's an angelic being of some sort. "I am a fellow servant of yours and your brethren who hold the testimony of Jesus. Worship God." Now we know John knew better. Why do you suppose John fell on his feet at this point and began worshiping?
Just the awe.
Absolutely. He is probably overcome at this point. And his mouth's hanging open and he's going, "This is just awesome." But in that context, this seraph or angel or whoever told him, said, "You need to get up." Said, "Don't be worshiping at my feet. You worship God." Which of course we know John knew better. But notice what he goes on to say. And he being I believe a seraph. "For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." Anybody want to take a wild guess at what they think he meant by that?
His testimony was going to the cross
Well,
and being resurrected, wasn't it?
Yeah, but
Jesus is
probably narrowing it down a little too much. Now look at it in context here. John has just fallen at the feet of this angelic being in awe and worship. And he's told, "Get up. Don't do that." Because the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. What has John been doing throughout this whole book? Prophesying. He's being given a vision of what's going to happen in the future. Everything that we've read here is a prophecy that John is being given. And he's writing all this down, recording it. And so in that context, he's told the spirit of, and in fact, let me reverse it so it makes better sense to us. The spirit of prophecy, which is what John's doing, is the testimony of Jesus. In other words, you're not here for me. Don't worship me. I'm just a servant like you are. You're here to testify about him.
Amen.
That's what he's being told here. It's the testimony of Jesus. That man over there on the throne. He's the one you're here to testify about, not me. Worship him. I struggled with that part of a verse for years until I finally looked at it in context and it finally hit me. It's like, that's what he's talking about. It's his answer to why John needs to get up off his face. Like, he's not there to worship the angel. The whole point that he's there for is to give a testimony of what that guy, Jesus, is going to do. Anyway, questions this evening? All right? Yes, sir.
Well, it sort of ties in this. I'm just curious with the saints that came right after the crucifixion. Were they resurrected at that point, or were the ones that were seen walking around after Christ had?
Oh no, they were not resurrected. Keep
Yeah.
in mind, there's a difference between a
Right.
resuscitation and a resurrection.
Right. So it was just their souls.
Yeah, well, not even their souls. Just look at it, just like Lazarus. When Lazarus was brought forth to the grave, did he get resurrected or did he get resuscitated?
Resuscitated. Yes.
That's what you saw when Jesus was crucified and we told these saints came up from the grave. They were
Yes.
not resurrected, and I can prove that to you in just a moment. They were resuscitated in sinful bodies that they continued to grow old and died again. Now, here's how we can know for a fact they could not have been resurrected. Who's the firstborn of the resurrection?
Jesus.
If those others had been resurrected, Jesus would not be the firstborn of the resurrection.
Sort of why I asked with the wording the way it is. It's,
Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they were brought back to life, but life in this body,
Gotcha.
not a resurrection body.
Yep. Just walking around in the spots. Okay.
I would have hated to have been Lazarus, though, because even after Christ healed him and brought him back from the dead, the Pharisees had already plotted that we got to kill him. He's living proof this man's God. We got to kill him. Which tells you just how evil they were. That they knew Lazarus had been brought back from the dead. And instead of getting on their face and worshiping Christ, it's like, oh, we got to kill him. People might find out.
They be out of job.
All right, anybody else? Okay. Stan, would